So our panelists today are Alex Walewski, who is the PI and Operations Director for the Brain Image Library, or BIL, which you've heard mentioned quite a few times so far. Lydia, of course, I think almost everybody here knows, has worked with Lydia. So Lydia is the Senior Director of Architecture at the Allen Institute for Brain Science. One of our panelists had dropped, so Dr. Peng had dropped. Jesse Gillis is a panelist for us, who's an associate professor at the Department of Physiology at the University of Toronto. Carol Thompson is another one of our panelists, who is the associate director of data management at the Allen Institute for Brain Science. And Yaroslav, I believe Yarek is how you like to be called, who is a PI of distributed archives for neurophysiology data integration at Dandy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open it up for our panelists and also presenters. So anybody who's presented, feel free to chime in here as we kind of discuss what we've heard so far. I have some general questions. Maybe I could start with some general questions and we can kind of go from there. And then just feel free to kind of respond to each other or the questions that I ask as we go through this panel discussion. So we've heard quite a bit from our speakers about standards, governance, tools, and infrastructure. This includes things for BICCN and BICAN, as well as other global efforts. So there seems to be a lot of things that are kind of circulating around, and there's general themes that we're kind of coming back to. So everybody seems to be coming back to standards, governance, tools, infrastructure, and how we manage each other as well. The first question is kind of broad. Is there anything that you would like to add to what our presenters have said so far, or is there anything that you would like to re-emphasize as being particularly important that you've heard so far in the presentations?
Hi, this is Alex. There is one thing that the last speaker brought up that I think we all need to be aware of, and that is really the challenge of dealing with petabyte data sets. And I don't think that the community really has a firm grasp of the different things that will need to change, both computationally wise and storage wise, to be able to make the data available to the public. And you know, that's just my observation. And you know, I think the whole idea of being able to compute on these large data sets in place, I think that particularly when we're talking about the petabyte data sets, the download model really doesn't work for petabyte data sets. Yes, you can slice and dice some data sets and download pieces of them, but it's really impractical to download petabytes, and one's going to need to compute in place to be able to do that. And to enable this computing in place, there's a lot of infrastructure work that needs to be done because of a lot of the other reasons that people have mentioned. Security, whether it's human subjects data, there's a lot of information that needs to be considered.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just another aspect, maybe it was mentioned, but just want to reemphasize that there are different initiatives across different fonts, different lands. Europe, they have their own initiatives. We are, after all, at INCF, International Neuroscience Coordination Facility meeting, and I think there could be or should be or more displayed of synergistic opportunities, but also existing collaborations across, the big ponds, because there is lots of initiatives, right? And some work from Allen Institute we used in Europe. We just listened about eBrains platform, right? So I wonder if there could be more integration across different initiatives, especially international, and what aspects should be kind of taken into account, like IP rights, protection, and whatnot.
Okay, go ahead, Carol.
Yeah, sure. It was a great set of talks this morning. I really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to the recordings coming out and those being available to people to see afterwards. I think as I listen to the themes that run through all of this, you have Marianne saying, well, there's a minimal metadata standard and it might not have everything, but if people do it, arguably that might be better than the perfect metadata standard that nobody wants to put into, right? So it's this balance of what do people need to reuse it versus is somebody willing to put that data there, right? As you go on down and you think about, as GQ said, it's not just about, meeting some milestones, the impact you're going to have on people. It's building things that impact people, right? And then as you get down to, I'm sorry, I did not hear how to say his name, Juice Wagner, saying that, it has to be about meaningful data sharing. So it's not just putting data out, but making sure people can use it. All of this is a balance. It's a balance between the people who are heads down looking at, I'm generating this data, I have something to do with it. Everything else is, just extra work for me when I'm busy trying to figure out the nervous system myself. But on the other end, we have the community and the users who could do so much more and make that data more impactful if we can make sure that the data is shared in a meaningful way, a way that people can actually reuse it. So everything we do in data platforms and data integration, it's a balancing act. And it's very tough to go between these. The only people we work with right now in the BICAN, when you start a consortium, maybe this gets to Marianne's arc about we're dysfunctional in year 3 and we get together to year 4. Maybe a lot of this is all because in the very beginning, we're only working with our data producers. They want to have an impact, but they got to do their own things too. Everybody's focusing so much on doing their own things that coming to the point of making sure that we're addressing those end users later on comes a little too late a lot of the time. So it's always this tension. You try to work with people to get somewhere that's going to be useful to end users, but your biggest stakeholders and speakers in the beginning are the data producers. So it's that remains a challenge on how do we get to that point where we can make sure that we can serve up things in the best way possible. And there's going to be some stress on the data producers to get stuff into a state that is really reusable and has more impact than just their papers in the future.
Jesse, I think your hand is next.
Yeah, just two small points, I guess. One is I was struck by Marianne's talk, which I really thought was very interesting, that, I did live through some of this with BICAN, BICCN, sorry, the generation 1 of BICAN. And I guess I'm struck in that case that we went through a lot of process, and I don't feel we evaluated very well how well that process worked at the end. And I wish there were more of a feedback loop in consortia. So consortia live and then they die or go on or whatever, but it does feel like, it's not like an economics or like natural selection sort of process where there's a feedback loop that we really know what worked and what didn't, and we can build on what worked and discard what didn't. So it feels redundant sometimes a bit. The other thing is, this is more about data production, but it's something that I always worry about consortia, which is that they create central points of failure in data generation practices. And so I do feel that that's not well understood sometimes by data generators who are used to optimizing for, and even pipeline runners too, and all sorts of, invested parties are often used to optimizing as opposed to trying to capture variability. And one of the strengths of science is we get variable practice and we see what works and what doesn't, and we are able to adjudicate that. Whereas sometimes consortia generate central points of failure where, well, yeah, let's all use this software. We heard about it. I won't name names, but previous consortia have come under criticism for using particular software pipelines. Let's say, Solo, and then external users didn't like that particular practice. And the same can be said of data, and the same can be said of lots of different aspects. And so, how to ensure that we capture variability across the field is something I think about.
Those are really excellent questions. So I'm kind of sensing a little bit of a theme here, and I think Marianne might have something to contribute because I see some comments in the chat here. So we have one theme that's kind of the size of the data that's going to be a challenge, and let's come back to that because it seems like it's something that is really kind of resonating with a lot of people. But the other theme seems to be something about more so like a personnel question. And so Marianne, you have so much experience, I think, here with the kind of personnel and organizing this stuff. And I think GQ has a question specifically about this in the chat. So GQ has a question to you that says, how can we change the timescale from year 4 to fourth quarter? Would you like to, I don't know, maybe take a stab at answering that question? I'm not expecting a straightforward and concise answer.
I'd like to hear from everybody because I think that this is really the essence, right? What are the steps that we can take in order to get this process going earlier? I think, Jesse, you mentioned it. A lot of people mentioned it. Carol mentioned it. We have this data generation going on, and the data generation early is very science focused, and this is what I can do. But yet the ultimate use of it is not going to depend completely on that, right? That there needs to be other things that go on. I mentioned some things which were curation and, I think thinking through from the very beginning, which I don't think was asked in BICCN so much, but was clearly asked in BICAN on the first day. At the end point, what is this going to look like? What are we delivering? Because that helps constrain what it is that you're going to do and the time scale. But the people aspect, this idea of taking people who had never worked together before, who maybe spend 2 months if you're lucky, but most people I know spend even less than that preparing a proposal. They then find out after the fact who it is that they're going to be working with. And then they're sort of thrown in saying, okay, right, let's go. And that sort of melding just seems to me to take time. And you see the difference between BICAN and BICCN because a lot of people work together in BICCN, right? Some components were done, people knew each other. And so we were able to carry over a lot of that to phase 2. But I don't really know how to accelerate it, except all of us have been finding during the pandemic, most projects have one live meeting per year where they bring everybody together. After not getting together live for 3 years, we finally started to have those meetings again. And everybody to a T just said how much more they got done there than they did in these virtual meeting cycles where you just simply can't pay attention long enough, right? You can't pay attention to every single meeting you have. These consortia have a lot of meetings. So I think I was talking to Anita, who just came back from a course of there are means to sort of jumpstart people working together. These are things that people do to start to establish those relationships and trust. But again, they can't just make these things one-off and one-on-one. Somehow this has to be communicated to the consortia. So I personally am toying with the idea of thinking that one ought to have, at least in the first year, multiple live meetings that have one in the beginning to say hello to everybody. Everybody says, here's what I do. Then there's work. You need to come together to work out problems. You need to then come together again to work out problems. And you need to come together again to work out problems, because I don't think that these human relationships form overnight. I think they take time. You need to have the supporting people as well. That's why I keep coming back to curators, which is, Joost, you said, we have a meaningful title, we have a meaningful description, not the way researchers think about data, right? That is the way curators think about data. So anyway, a little rambling, but maybe get us started on that theme because it is the central issue here.
Mike, I think you had your hand up next.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on Marianne's comment a little bit there. I think, Marianne, part of the thing is there are other issues. The organization and finances required to hold meetings that involve everybody, the timing, you see how how difficult it is even to get PIs for a virtual phone call, never mind a meeting. So I certainly am not disagreeing with your premise, but I'm just like to add that one thing that might be possible is a somewhat more creative kind of notion of these in-person meetings, namely that select groups meet in person and feed up to organizational structures which benefit from them, right? In other words, there's more local meetings or something, or involving stakeholders that then feed into a growing kind of delivery. I think that if we expect, another trouble with the annual kind of meeting thing is, in fact, often not as much is accomplished as we might like to, because there's so much just catch up and meet and greet. And I think that we could do a lot better in terms of the, this kind of doing the process of doing science, I guess. That's what I want to say.
Just
Yeah, maybe so just from my side, like I 100% agree with Marianne here. The other thing that we are seeing too is that just like for these projects, it takes time just to ramp up your internal team. Like typically you need to actually hire people, and none of that is thought about by the funders typically, because they want to have a grant funded and then up and running within the first week. And so I think part of it is also being good as the data coordination centers to be able to be somewhat aggressive in setting expectations, especially for the first year. Because I do think that taking the first year and giving yourself breathing room as a data coordination center to actually think through what is the right roadmap and how do we do this in this newly established collaboration, sometimes gets put aside, and people are just starting to build and starting to talk to the data generators right away. And then you get onto a path that it's hard to get off of. And so having that initial period where, as the data coordination center, you say, like, look, we need a couple of months, and that might actually include an in-person meeting between the PIs or like the senior personnel, just to say, we need to now go back, look at our milestone or look at our proposal, and now build the actual roadmap and how we're going to do that again. And so building that into a timeline, I think is very important. And then the second thing is, like, some of these things just take time. And so instead of saying, how can we defy those, we can just embrace it and say, like, yes, it is okay that this takes time. And as long as we're dedicated, then we will get where we want to be.
yes, GQ.
Yeah, I think there are two aspects to the Marianne's original kind of title indicated question. One is, do we feel we're on the right track and everybody can work productively, right? At what time, at what point we can have a consortium sense of that. But the other one is that that's right. I mean, a lot of things, Jesse, are a necessary discovery process. There are a lot of things that are in uncharted water, and we have never been there in those kind of situations. We just need to work through to even uncover or discover what kind of topic, what kind of issues needs to be addressed that cannot be fully anticipated at the proposal stage or early funding stage, and so, but as long as we feel like we're in a productive, coherent framework, and people working together and contributing, we should be on the right track, and we should not be worried too much, because then the rest of this will take its course, right, to achieve its end goal.
Yes, Jesse.
So how do we know we're on the right course? Like, how do we get that feedback? And I guess one of the things I think that happened somewhat by chance in the BICCM that I feel is missing a bit in BICAN is the accidental insertion of downstream users into the consortium. And so there ended up being, like, because there were these collaborators, people, and they weren't necessarily doing upstream tasks that were for the consortium. They were data users. I feel like there was more of that. And I felt like they gave a lot of help and guidance in a way, you want feedback not from the people, at NIH or something like that about how the consortium is doing. You want it really from the field. I mean, from both. I'm not saying not both, but and I thought we got a lot of that in the ICCN sort of by chance. And I'm not sure we're getting as much now.
Yeah, so I agree, Jesse, and in Spark we had dedicated user groups and dedicated usability people who were evaluating what had been done all along, and gave that sort of external feedback. Never as much as you like, because it's hard to get these people, but I think always having that sort of external reference group or somebody to say how are we doing is a really important piece. And I think a lot of what we're also talking about here is that if one wants to fund effective consortia, there are these other things that have to be funded, right? And it just may be that there is a certain amount that has to go to these things that is typically not done, right? It goes to all the development. But that's why I think that there are different phases of the project, and having these touch points where the users get to say, is this working? Is there something of value there, or what would I like to see? Are just these really important external checks, because every time we give presentations, everything is fine, everything works, everything is grand. Only we know that's not true, right? We know that's not true. We know we could always do better. And I think that because the papers get published and there are real scientific results that come out that are important and good, that we often leave the other things sort of half done, and they're not as good as they could be. If that's what a product is supposed to be, then it should be a good one.
Yeah, I'd like to,
Carol, yeah.
I'd like to, and getting back to kind of what I was saying before, this push and pull between people generating data and people who need to hopefully reuse data, consume data later on. Part of our challenge here, of course, is that, it takes a while to get a consortium off the ground to the point, especially now where we have this wonderful integrated ecosystem. It takes a while to get that data generated, so you don't have something to start testing the consumers on very quickly, right? So it's getting to the point now, hopefully, we can bring in some of those consumers. We have to figure out who they are, not the data generators, but the reusers or the consumers. And hopefully, a big part of where we need to go into in the consortium now that data is being generated are integrative analysis. And that's, I think, what you're referring to is in the BICCN, we have these great integrative analysis groups where people were comparing data, comparing findings, developing new methodologies to use across multiple data sets from multiple users. And that's really the test. They're kicking the tires of the data. And I think that's a point where it takes a while to get the data out so that you could do that. Everybody's attention focused on just getting off the ground. And hopefully this is the perfect time in year 2, not in year 3 or year 4, hopefully in year 2 to get that done. But one other challenge that I see that we have is that, we have to have that product vision. The BICCN, we didn't have the final product vision. And a lot of it is that I think in the BICCN, we didn't have enough investment in how are we developing some of these products, right? So we have some early steps towards scientific vision that have happened here, but not on what that final product is. And I'm hoping some of that comes from the integrative analyses groups as well. And the other challenge being that, okay, who's doing some work? The great news is in BICAN, you've got this knowledge base effort, right, to start trying to pull stuff together. But there's still some gaps in potentially in understanding what that final product is, right, to be delivered that people can interact with, and making sure that we get those, as you said, those user groups engaged early on to kind of understand how that's going to be useful. So hopefully we're all thinking about this today, and these are our lessons we're all learning and food for thought as we try to improve how we execute.
Go ahead, Mike.
I just want to add one thing, is that, I think that this is of course we can't do all that much maybe about the constraints that we have, and namely the major constraint is the structure imposed by NIH funding mechanism and establishment of a consortia. But I would like to highlight that maybe this is not a completely hopeless concern, that maybe more could be done to facilitate a better structure, which would really enhance the possibility of success. You know, all this conversation takes the tone of that we're just given this, you know, and I think it's largely true. We're given this infrastructure, given this structure and initial conditions, and we have to make the best of it. And we go around all kinds of circles trying to fill in all these gaps. But if there were, maybe we could also think about ways in improving NIH's kind of, you know, way of approaching these problems so as to set the initial conditions in a little bit better place. That's all.
Yep, go ahead.
Just a quick comment while talking about users. I think there is, of course, point to separate data producers from data users, but quite often it's really important also, or quite useful, to have users who are producers, right? Producers who are users. Because otherwise what we encounter in the archive, that many people arrive to, oh, let's archive the data at the end of their scientific kind of project, right? And that becomes then not that useful, because maybe it's that even not reproducible or data is broken. When they become users of the data in standardized form, when they collect it, then it becomes super useful, because that's where reproducibility comes from. So I wonder if it's important to kind of make also synergistic attempt to have this group of data producer users, right, who kind of promise that for their research projects, they will be part of this effort on both ends.
Yeah, all excellent ideas, and to speak to something that Mike said, one of the outcomes of this workshop for us, the organizers, is to write a white paper that could include things like these recommendations. So you know, there's a lot of knowledge here that's being shared, and it's a lot of knowledge that's not being shared too. But you know, collectively we have a lot of experience doing this, and it would be good if we could kind of get some of this down in a paper, and so we could make kind of a little guide for people who are interested in these types of problems and these types of issues. Before I go back, so I want to get back to something that Alex said at the beginning of the panel discussion, because I think it's really important, and I think there's probably going to be a lot to say about it. Is there anything else that we would like to say about kind of how the consortium is kind of organized, these kind of maybe personnel or organizational issues before we switch topics? Okay, so one of the things that struck me with Yost's talk is he said that open data should not be free data, and I kind of want to write that down and put it around everywhere I can see it, and kind of maybe kind of bomb my city with it. But the idea here is that we're moving in scale, and I think that keeping in mind how large the scale of data is when we're talking about petabyte level data, I don't think that we really, or at least I don't, I know that some people probably do, I don't always think of it, I just think of it as a new prefix on the size of the data, and I don't stop to think about how large that actually is. And so Marianne had a comment, which is kind of a question here. How do you think the consortia will have to change to accommodate this scale? And so I'm going to open this to the panelists or any of the presenters who want to try to answer that question. Owen, go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm not a panelist, but I have a vested interest in a lot of issues relevant to sort of the petabyte scale that we're heading towards. We really have to confront at the archive a lot of data storage strategies, and we took a very careful look at some of the models that Google platform and Azure platform use for balancing between how many times people can access data and the cost that will be involved with the data. And we basically got to sort of come up with our own model before we even know what the data usage patterns are going to be for us making some choices with that. And one of the things that's very definitely an implication of this is that a certain point we'd like to essentially associate data with hot storage, so lots of people can act on it, and then move it over to colder storage. And one of the things that means is that you definitely have a backup, but if you keep on going to that backup frequently, it starts to cost a lot of money. And I assume that part of that model and how we're going to migrate towards that shift will have to involve essentially policy discussions with everyone involved in the consortium about sort of when do we consider that shift to make sense. You know, I assume it'll be associated with pre-publication versus post-publication. But as it's already been stated, there's just incredibly large monetary impact associated with these strategies. And the last thing I want to do is come at the consortium and just and sort of say, well, we have to do it in some particular way. But I have to, in a sense, I'd feel a lot better if there was basically a data usage committee that I could be working with, and some type of governance that safeguarded that there was really good oversight, and it wasn't just, you know, me or my team declaring by fiat how this process was going to happen. So I'll put that out there. And I think in a lot of ways, that's kind of a boring answer to one of the things that you were bringing up. But I can promise people this is a discussion that's going to be coming up in the near future.
Lydia, I think you were next.
Riffing off what Owen's saying is also, and Josh also, that there's different levels of data have different sizes and also different users, right? The major petabyte scale often is data that needs to get processed, and by aligning it to something, there's often a data reduction, and then there's further data reductions, and you'll find that the number of users are different in those things. So there shouldn't be a uniform policy like everything is free or everything costs something, but depending on that tier, and then depending on knowing how many people or groups are going to be in each of those tier, how much investment do you put in there, right? So the massive data like the raw FASTQ file and raw images, to what extent, you know, do they stay around? If they go to very cold storage, to what needs to happen in order to say that we are going to pull it out for analysis, that sort of thing. Just to note that the various one, and not all the users are going to go and come at that high resolution, large data set, right? I know there's machine learning and all of that stuff, but that group also has got to be really funded in order to do that. So there is like a tiering system, and there are actually different users at different levels, and we have to sort that out as well, because, you know, we can talk about the features as being very cheap. They can be replicated, they can multiply, and then there's less multiplication. So that's got to sort of, if we have that data governance panel or data committee, that tiering system should also come into play as well.
Yeah, I think you said exactly what I was going to. So I think that at some point there's a difference between data sharing and data archiving. And so it also kind of goes like, what is the goal of what we are trying to build here? Are we trying to archive all data such that we can say it is somewhere? Or is that still, or is the backup, like, is the backup a deliverable of the data core, or is backing up data still responsibility of the original investigators? I think that's a question that is somewhat unknown. But to both of your points, Owen and Lydia, like, yeah, we have to go to tiered, like the difference in storage cost between tiered and readily accessible data is large enough that we are forced to leverage that at this point. But at these scale data sets, like even deeper storage starts to add up. And I mean, one of the things that you know, if you have an unsuccessful repository, it's easy to sustain it, right? Because you don't have any egress fees. The problem becomes when you are successful and people are actually using the data. That's actually much harder. And so we need to make sure that we're not getting towards a point where we declare success because we're sustainable, but the reason is that nobody's using us. And so figuring out like, how can you be sustainable while aiming to be very successful, I think is one of the bigger challenges that we're facing.
I think Alex, you're the next hand up.
I just wanted to, I think this has been a fascinating discussion, and I just wanted to bring up one other point that's related, and that is, you know, determining what is the life cycle of data that's out there. I mean, we've generated a lot of data with BICCN. There's been a lot of data that's been generated with some past efforts. Is when is it appropriate to, I don't know, I hate to throw away data, but when is it appropriate to, let's just say, de-emphasize that data? Is it, you know, so many years, certain data types, certain resolution of data sets? I think, you know, these issues are some that we need to seriously think about and come to a decision on.
Shouldn't it relate to previous comment? Like if it's not used, right? Then it's easy to maintain, but also easy to put it under the carpet. But yeah.
I mean, usage definitely will play a role in that.
And I mean, again, it's as Alex pointed, there's resolution, and also maybe the results, the quantification is what people come back to over and over again. Much smaller, we can keep them around for a longer period of time. It's also which part of it does it get it less de-emphasized as well, right?
Anita, I think you had the next hand.
So just thinking out loud, like how do you get the how do you get more use of the data? And it really comes back down to the FAIR principles and being able to find it and being able to have a landing page, which I think a lot of us have sort of converged on as a very important part of a data set, right? We know that these data sets, you know, as has been pointed out in the various talks, are, you know, they're not necessarily file 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? They might be file 2, 3, and 7. But having at least the you know, a sense that the metadata that's associated with the deposition of that particular file and a nice landing page that's human readable at the repository. I mean, those are both things that I think really promote the reuse of that data. And you know, here again, I mean, one of the reasons that we have these beautiful landing pages is because there's curation on top of that effort. And you know, this is effort that we need to recognize in addition to the egress and you know, ingest fees. I mean, to expect that the investigator does all of this themselves and becomes a data curator, which is a completely different set of tasks and knowledge, is probably not terribly realistic. So I think we're also, you know, with this discussion, yes, the data movement is definitely a problem. It can be up to tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars, but we also need to understand and recognize that actually putting together data sets that are understandable is also going to cost some money. So just wanted to give the plug for the curation effort that is needed to make some of this happen. And I know that Carol is for BICCN has been the curator in addition to everything else. And you know, I just want to applaud the efforts there because they were quite significant. So.
So I just wanted to make a comment about this value determining like what you should keep in spinning disk, as we used to call it, right, versus what goes into cold storage. I was on the National Academy panel that tried to determine that. And of course you couldn't really, right? Because you can always find some reason why something might potentially be useful. But it is also true that it is those in the domain who might be able to take some shots and some guidelines, right? All things being equal. You don't have to do anything until you get highly successful, because then you have to make choices. And we've gone through periods, those of us who have lived through this, where it seemed like storage was like endless, right? And it would just keep doubling and we wouldn't have to worry about any of these things. But we know that, right, the latent information in a biological system will overwhelm whatever it is that we have if you keep everything. So I think in terms of what Yara said with the international component, these are the types of guidelines coming from the neuroscience infrastructure providers with consideration of users and other things that really do help people, right? They help funders, they help everybody when the community comes together and says, this is how I think it ought to work. Because NIH has the same problem, right? They typically, I've heard numbers thrown around like, well, we expect data to be useful for 10 years and not after that. Well, if you're HM's brain, no, it's useful for a lot longer than 10 years, or if depending on the nature of the data, it might be. And if we can, develop those types of guidelines or recommendation, or even just hold a little workshop on it, I often find those types of artifacts are just very useful to everybody concerned.
Lydia, go ahead.
It's part of this also, I mean, to keep data sets alive needs funding. And is it also part of the funder's responsibility too? I mean, given the your input from committees to say, like, you're producing this data set for this grant, and the expectations are very like you will share it, but do they need to say you should share it for this amount of years? And that this part, someone has to say something, like someone's need to put some so that people can even cost against it. When it's kind of vague, nobody thinks about it, and also nobody costs it out as well. So does it need to come from our funding body to say something so that people can even cost it out for them, to know that if you want this, then part of your research funding need to sponsor in a particular way. So that's the other dimension of it. Like, where does the funding body comes in this equation?
So I'll just make a quick comment because I see, Mike, you have your hand up. I actually broached that with an NIH program official who is not on this call. This was a couple of years ago, because I said, if you at least communicate a number to us, whatever it is, that if you are going to host a data center or you're going to produce data, we are expecting that data to be available for 10 years at least. It doesn't have to be hard and firm. But the minute you say that, then costs can be estimated. And without that, it's sort of open-ended, right? How long is this supposed to go for? What am I supposed to do? I seem to recall that I heard a presentation in Canada from one of their national level data groups where they said, we are defining this as 20 years, like we are defining this as longer than 20 years. And just those types of numbers give you something to shoot for. And without them, as you said, you're just operating in the dark. You just try to keep everything available as long as you possibly can. And as we know, that's not sustainable. So I agree.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, my comment is directly related to what Lydia raised. Is that the trouble is that our funding sources don't act as if the data is valuable. Let me elucidate that a little bit. That almost all the money goes into the generation of new data from the premise that we really don't know very much about anything from what we've already generated, and it's going to be this new method and new data set which will shed all the new light on things. And so furthermore, there's little money produced for infrastructure and archival things that preserve, comparatively speaking, little money that preserve and extract value from existing data sets. So I think there's a dichotomous kind of viewpoint there that should really be thought about, right? If you want to maintain data, if you value data, you should put your money where your mouth is. Otherwise, it may fall by the wayside. So.
Excellent points. I'd like to thank everybody who participated in this panel discussion. I know we went a little bit long, so we don't have a ton of time left, but we do have some breakout rooms. And so the breakout rooms, we have 2 of them. And so the first breakout room is on standardization, governance, and success metrics. Success metrics. The second breakout room is on data integration tools and infrastructure. And so we're about 15 minutes. So we're just going to cut the breakout rooms time down to about 15 minutes because our panel discussion went a little bit long. Which is okay, because I think we talked about some really great things and some things that are relevant to everybody who's here. And so I wouldn't want those to be siloed in our breakout room either. I'm going to open the breakout rooms.
Oh, Patrick, you didn't get to answer the Mondo question. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'll go ahead and say it because we're all here. And I was just getting ready to speak. And I think it kind of goes back to something Lydia was saying, and something that Owen said that I think, or a question that Owen asked about how we kind of standardize these things where they're maybe a little bit idiosyncratic. And so, Lydia is saying, can you find the term library in some ontology? Yeah, I'm sure you can. But you can find it in a lot of ontologies, and you find that it is used in a lot of different ways. In the same way that we're using the term data set, it's used in a lot of different ways. And so I think kind of getting agreement within ourselves, which is not always something that's very easy. That's not a trivial thing to do. That's something that we should kind of start out doing. And then when we can, we want to reuse, right? And so if it happens that what we agree on aligns with something that's already existing, then we'll go ahead and align with that. But the first thing is to make sure that our house is in order. And then once our house is in order, we can kind of outreach to others and start linking those things. Owen, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, if we're on a different schedule, just tell me to stand down. But I think one of the reasons that many different enterprises just can't adopt metadata is because they have a huge investment. And one group is using ICD-9, another group is using the disease ontology, and it's not something that they can easily migrate away from. And for some of the data types that I was describing, not all of them, but some of them, one of the biggest issues that I think will be an increasingly difficult challenge when you're describing something like collection is the enterprise investment is really going to be on the lab side. It's going to be how different groups are actually describing something as simple as sample, specimen, and the libraries that are derived from them, and the multi-modalities that are derived from them. And those will be those were sort of essentially data models that were developed within an institution. They'd had no idea that they would necessarily be having to kind of combine or share or agree on those data models. And now we're probably going to be faced with that under the BICAM. And that will be a big challenge.
Excellent points all around. Sorry, our breakout room discussion kind of leaked into the main room, but we are at time or over time a little bit. But on behalf of Bingjing and Marianne, I just wanted to say thank you all for participating in the workshop, especially thank you for all of you who presented and participated in the panel discussion, and just everybody who attended. If you want to continue the discussion, feel free to email either Bingxing or myself. We'd like to thank the INCF as well for giving us the opportunity to host this workshop. It's been immensely important for us to discuss this, something that we really wanted to do. Thank you to BICAN for helping sponsor the workshop. Thank you to all the speakers and panelists again, and thank you for the audience. We'll send out a follow-up email with a link to the white paper that we are working on. And if you want to participate in contributing to the white paper with all these great ideas and suggestions, feel free to do that. But of course, no obligation.